Tidbits on the Torah weekly portion. This week the portion is EKEV. And EKEV, the word itself, conveys a lot of different meanings. In Hebrew, in general, which is a very limited language in terms of the number of words and roots of words, but every word could have a host of meanings. That's why no translation is adequate, even if it's a correct translation, because it only gives you one nuance of that word, whereas that word could have many nuances. For example, the word EKEV, the name of the Parsha, in the context and the way it's translated, it would translate as follows: V'haya EKEV tishma'un, and it will be because of your listening. He goes on to say, because you listen to God's commandments, you will guard them, so God will keep his covenant and his promise to you. Okay, so the word EKEV has been translated here as because. The word EKEV also means heel, part of the body, the heel. How does heel fit in here? So Rashi says, there are certain mitzvahs that a person treads upon with his heel. It's an expression that demonstrates a person's lack of respect for the integrity of certain mitzvahs, of certain commandments. There are things that people just say, that's not important, and they step on it. So the Torah here is saying that what is God referring to when he refers to keeping the commandments? He's referring specifically to those commandments that people consider to be less important. That's a second translation. A third translation is the word EKEV comes from the root heel, yes, just as we said before, but in a different context. As the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, explained, that the words here mean that you will listen to God, but they're listening. You can listen to God on one level, and you can listen to God on another level. The ultimate goal here is that your listening should reach every fiber of your being, including your EKEV, including your heel. That means that it's not just something you do, but it's something that you live, and it becomes a part of you, and it extends to every part. I'll return to this in a moment, but just the other translation of the word EKEV means the end. Just like the heel is the end of the body, here it can mean at the end of days, you will listen to everything God promises you, and God will give you all the good blessings that he promised. So some say this means that God is saying, when will we enjoy all these blessings? EKEV, at the end, at the Messianic age. But the Hasidic interpretation is that in the end of days, before the final redemption, we will already listen to God's commandments. And as they say, why are you arguing about whether you should do something or not do? In the end, you're going to do it anyhow, so you might as well start doing it now. So you have EKEV means because, EKEV means mitzvahs that people tread on with their heel, EKEV means that the mitzvahs have to extend to the heel, EKEV means in the end of days you will be rewarded, and EKEV means in the end of the days you will follow God's commandments. So we have 5 different nuances here of the word EKEV. Now there's a midrash that says something on the surface, doesn't seem to have any connection to this verse. The midrash very often will start off with a discussion of Jewish law and connect that to the Parsha. Well, here it talks about the law of a menorah that is made up of different sections, and the question is, are you allowed to carry that menorah? Because there's a danger if you carry it, you might put the sections together and construct the menorah, and the law is you can't construct a menorah on Shabbos. You're not allowed to create vessels on a Shabbos, and therefore you shouldn't carry it. What does that have to do with the words EKEV, with the statement over here that you will follow God's commandments and God will reward you? So one explanation is that the word for sections is perik. Perik means sections. It can also mean intervals. There's a passage in the Talmud that if a person studies Torah only intermittently, liprakim, he studies and he takes a break and he studies, that's not considered positive learning, which raises a question. Most people are like that. Most people are indeed encouraged to set aside times when they learn Torah, at least in the morning and the evening, so they're doing it in intervals. They're doing it intermittently. So one of the explanations of that is that it doesn't mean that if a person doesn't study Torah all the time, the Torah study is worthless. It means that whenever you study, that study has to extend even to the time that you're not studying. It has to be translated into your behavior. Even when you're at work, you work with integrity. You're influenced and inspired by the Torah that you learned before and the Torah you will learn afterwards. In that sense, you never really interrupt it. It's not made up of sections. It's one continuum, one seamless continuum going from the study of Torah to the type of profession you're engaged in. There is nothing that really separates. It's not intermittent. It's considered to be continuous. Similarly, when a person studies Torah and it only exists in the person's mind, it's a scholastic and academic exercise, and it doesn't reach every part of your being, including the heel, that's called learning Torah in a way that the sections are apart. And even if you try to put them together, it doesn't really work for Shabbos. Shabbos is a metaphor for the future Messianic age. If you want to have an ideal way of doing the mitzvahs, study of Torah, you have to see that it extends to every part of your being. So the Torah goes on to make all these promises of all the good things that will happen. Now, before we go any further, I said that the opening word is EKEV. That's actually the second word of the Parsha. The first word of the Parsha is V'haya, and it will be. And it will be. And then it says EKEV, because, or heal, however we translate it. Now, there's a medrash that says that whenever the Torah uses the expression V'haya, and it will be, it's an expression of joy. When it uses the past tense, Vayehi, and it was, that's an expression of misfortune. But this is V'haya, this is the expression of joy. So where's the joy over here? So some say that what is the promise that God has made? It's not enough to keep the commandments, we have to keep them with joy. Another interpretation, and this gives you a sixth translation of the word EKEV, but it's related to the fact that the EKEV is the heel, the lowest part of the body. When a person acts like an EKEV, that means when a person acts humbly, that person will be happy. Humility and happiness go together. People who are arrogant, people who are egotistical, are never going to be happy because they never feel that they have enough, and they're never satisfied with what they have because they think that God owes them a lot more, or society owes them a lot more. Humble people are also happy people, and therefore the Torah says, V'haya, you want to be happy? EKEV, be humble. So we have a sixth nuance of the word EKEV. Now a seventh nuance of the word EKEV, because in the Torah it talks about, because you listen to what? To these mishpatim. Mishpatim is only one of three categories of mitzvahs. There are three types of mitzvahs. There's the mitzvahs that we do that are chukim, that have no rational basis. We do them because God said so, primarily. Then we have those testimonies, testimonial commandments like Shabbos, like Passover, like Tefillin, like Mezuzah. There are signs and symbols and reminders and testimonies to various historical events. Those, though we would never have thought of them on our own, but once they're given, we can understand them. They make sense. It's part of societal norm to want to have testimonials and remembrances of events of the past and so on. But then there's mishpatim. Those are the civil laws, the rational commandments that anyone could have thought of even if the Torah had not been given. Yet over here, in most places in the Torah will list all three. Here the Torah just says, it will come to pass because of your listening to these mishpatim, to these rational commandments. Why does it leave out all the others? And one explanation is that the word EKEV over here, which means the end or the heel or humility, also has another connotation. It's not another translation, but another connotation, that it is something that you do because you have accepted the yoke of heaven. That means that even if it's rational, even though you do it, of course, because it makes sense, you're not going to go out and kill someone because it's rational. But even that commandment, which we do or don't do, if it's a negative commandment, because it's rational, we fundamentally adhere to it because we accepted God's authority. And that ultimately, if a person only desists from killing because it's based on rationality, then if the argument can be convincing enough that would justify murder or theft or any of the other civil laws, one would change their view and allow it because it's based on their own subjective rationality. Every commandment, besides the fact that we have to do it because it makes sense, the foundation has to be EKEV. EKEV means the foundation. The heel is the concept of Kabbalah's ol, as it's called, the acceptance of the yoke of the heavenly kingdom. So we had 7 different nuances over here of that first verse. We're not going to belabor this point anymore. And God makes all these promises. Moses is repeating over here. And goes on to recount events of the past. He says, you will remember, when you come to Israel, you should remember the entire road on which God, your God, led you these 40 years in the wilderness, so as to afflict you, to test you, to know what is in your heart, whether you observe his commandments or not. So whenever the Jews had something lacking, it was a test. And that's a general approach to all different lapses, all different tragedies, that while we don't understand ultimately why God has to do things the way he does them, we have to understand that it is a test. God often tests our faith. Then it goes on, and he afflicted you and let you hunger, and then he fed you the manna that you didn't know, nor did your forefathers know, in order to make you know that not by bread alone does man live, rather by everything that emanates from the mouth of God does man live. So here there are several points that I'd like to focus on. There's a midrash that on the surface is hard to understand. It's one of these cryptic midrashim that says, how do we know you're supposed to light Shabbos candles Friday before sunset? Because it says in this verse, and he afflicted you and let you hunger and he fed you the manna. What's the connection? Well, the midrash does this very often. It will put together 2 totally unrelated things, but there's a catch to it. There is a connection to it. The Talmud speaks about this verse, and it understands it in a different way than most people would read it. Most people would read it that God afflicted you, and he made you hungry, and then he gave you the manna, which satisfied your hunger. The Talmud says, no. It means that God gave you the manna, and you still remained hungry and afflicted. The manna did not satisfy your hunger fully. Why not? So the Talmud explains, it gives 2 reasons, but one of the reasons is because the manna had all the tastes in the world, virtually every taste you want. You wanted ice cream, you tasted ice cream. You wanted steak, you tasted steak. Could you want steak and ice cream together? That's an interesting question, which we're not going to get into. You didn't eat steak, you didn't eat the ice cream, it was just a seed coming from heaven. So it's not meat and it's not dairy, and it's just heavenly food. But at any rate, you would feel and detect any taste you wanted. So the question is, why weren't they satisfied? Because when you can't see what you're eating, you do not enjoy it, and it doesn't satisfy you as much. Part of the psychology of eating, it's part of the neurological system, it's psychological. Some people can be satisfied with one type of food and not with another, with a certain amount, and others need a greater amount. It's very much in the mind. And if the mind can't see what it's eating, the person cannot see what it's eating, the mind doesn't give you the signal, I'm satisfied, because you still didn't get what you wanted, even though you had the taste of it. I guess if you take tofu, you can turn that into anything you want virtually. Even if it tastes like steak, and I'm not sure it does, no one's going to say, let's go out tonight for a tofu. A steak is a steak. So the Talmud is saying that by not seeing it, you do not appreciate it. And that's one of the reasons we light Shabbos candles. In the olden days, they didn't have electricity, so if you came home Friday night from the synagogue, it's dark outside, and you sit down to eat your meal, It's going to be a very unenjoyable meal because you can't see the food you're eating. And that's one of the reasons we light Shabbos candles, one of many reasons, to guarantee that we enjoy the Shabbos. That's the basis of it from here. The fact that it called eating the manna affliction and hunger, which is because you can't see what you're eating, that's the reason why we have to light Shabbos candles. But there's also a metaphoric thing over here about Shabbos candles, that it's intended to help us see around us, because our blindness is not physical blindness. We could see things physically and not appreciate what they're all about. You could see things, you could see a person and you see the person's faults, but you can't see their qualities. You don't see what's really going on inside of them. You could see the world around you and see the world going in a natural way and not recognize that there's a divine hand behind everything. And if you don't see the reality of life, you don't get the most out of life. And that's why we light Shabbos candles as a way of illuminating the world. In the weekdays, we're part of the natural world, which is concealed. The word world in Hebrew means concealment. The word nature means submerged. Shabbos is a day when we're withdrawn from nature, withdrawn from the concealment of the world. But people could keep their eyes metaphorically, figuratively closed and not see the light. So we light the Shabbos candles as a way of illuminating the reality of the world, that it's a different world on Shabbos. We see each other differently, we see God differently, we see nature differently. Okay, then, after Moses goes through a long discussion about the land of Israel, he says, V'yachalta, you will eat, B'savata, you will be satisfied, U'berachtas Hashem Elokecha, you will bless God your God for the good land that He has given you. This is the basis of the commandment to recite Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, that when you eat and you're satisfied, you have to bless God. The rabbis extended this commandment, which is applicable after you eat, and after you eat bread and a satisfying meal, they extended that to include a blessing for every food that you eat. If you eat a requisite amount, and after you finish eating, you say a special blessing. If it's cake, it's one blessing. If it's wine, it's a variation of that. If it's any other type of food, then there's a separate blessing. In addition to that, the rabbi said before you eat, you also have to recite a blessing. And they say if you have to recite a blessing after you finish eating, when you already had the benefit, certainly before you're deriving benefit from something that belongs to God, you have to ask permission. And therefore the blessing before is dictated rationally from the fact that we have to bless God after. Now the blessing, the Birkat HaMazon, consists of 4 blessings. One of the blessings, the first one, was composed by Moses to thank God for the manna from heaven. Well, why do we have to do that today? Our food is not manna from heaven. But the truth is, as the Hasidic masters point out, that everything that we eat, that includes every part of nature that we enjoy, that we may have invested, we're farmers, we get a salary, so we have money to buy our food, to buy our needs, it's all manna from heaven. We think we are the ones who generated that income or produced that food. The truth is that if God wants, nothing in the world will help us get our food, and if God wants, minimal effort will produce the same amount of food. There's a famous story of Reb Zusha, the famous Hasidic master, who after his attendant would put the food on the table, Zusha would say, God, Zusha is hungry, please give me some food. And then he would start eating. He also recited the blessing, obviously. That the attendant was a little bit upset. Why is he, the food is right in front of him. I put it in front of him. Why is he saying, God, Zusha wants to eat? As if he's not going to get the food unless he says those words. So one day he decides, I'm going to teach Zusha a lesson, and he wasn't going to put any food for him that morning. Well, the day before, Zusha took a walk, and he had to cross a little stream, and there was a log on the stream, and you had to know how to balance yourself. And he was walking, and some very wealthy guy sees a schlepper. Zusha was a poor man dressed in tatters going on that log, so he thought he'll poke some fun at him, and he pushes him off the log into the water. It wasn't threatening, the water was not deep, but he's all dirty and muddy from the water, and the rich man is laughing uncontrollably, And someone who saw that was aghast. He says, "Do you know who that was? That's the holy Rabbi Zusha. You better do something to placate him." Well, the rich man decided he's going to do something. So the next morning, as Zusha sits down at the table, an empty table, and he says, "God, Zusha is hungry," the rich man throws a sack of the delicacies in through the window as a way of appeasing Zusha for what he did to him. When the attendant saw that, he realized that God is the one who feeds him, not him. So that's the first blessing. It's the manna from heaven, that every time we eat food, it is manna from heaven, even though it comes through the earth or through the supermarket shelves. Kids today will tell you food comes on supermarket shelves. The second blessing was instituted by Joshua, Yehoshua, who succeeded Moses and who conquered the land of Israel. And it's a blessing to thank God for the land. That not only do we have manna from heaven, we have our own land, and we have to thank God for the agricultural prowess. And it's interesting that today Israel is at the forefront of agriculture and ahead of any other country in that technology. And that's a special blessing. We're thanking God for the land. But the Talmud says that when you thank God for the land, you have to include two things: the bris, the circumcision, and Torah. Because without those two, we wouldn't have the land. And that's a response to those people who say, look, Israel is very bright. We have the top scientists, the top researchers, and we're very high up there in the world of technology. And Israel could thrive and survive without the spiritual dimension. That's not the case. The only reason we have access to the land is because we are circumcised. That means we are distinguished. We are separated from the other nations of the world. We recognize we have our special mission that's translated physically in the circumcision, and we also have the Torah. The third blessing was composed by David and Solomon, because until King David and Solomon, the land was not stable. There was no unified leadership, and we were not really living in a land that we could say we could hold on to, because we didn't have that unity and that endurance. So when the kings David and Solomon established the monarchy, and through that they created Jerusalem and they built the temple, that's what gave the land its special distinction and the Jewish people their power to endure. So those are the three blessings. The fourth blessing came about later, when after Tisha B'Av, years after the temple was destroyed, the second temple, the city of Beitar was wiped out by the Romans, and they massacred the entire population. And to add insult to injury, and I think we discussed this a few weeks ago, they didn't allow the Jews to bury their dead. It took a few years, and they finally allowed them to bury the dead. Now, two miracles happened. Miracle number one, that after a few years of bodies, hundreds of thousands of bodies strewn all over the land, the bodies did not decay. That was one great miracle. The second miracle was that the Romans allowed them to bury their dead. So we say a blessing in which we repeat the word goodness twice. Hatov v'hameitiv, God who is good and who does good. Which means that even though this was a tragic time, it was the beginning and the onset of the dismal, dark exile, but because we saw some light in the darkness, that's also a reason to show our gratitude to God. That throughout our exile, there have been very bad moments, or we should say really very painful moments. Once asked a great rabbi about a great rabbi asked someone about how he's doing, and he said, terrible, bad. He says, no, don't say bad, say bitter. God does not give us anything bad. He gives us bitter things, but not bad things. Everything that comes from God is good, but they can be bitter. Bad is only to be used when we do things that are wrong. We could call that bad because we're going against God. But whatever God does is essentially either sweet or bitter. That's why Rosh Hashanah, which is coming up pretty soon, we ask not only for a good year, because good could be even things that are bitter. We ask God, we want a good and sweet year, because we want the type of good that is also sweet. So the idea of the fourth blessing is to recognize that in spite of the bitterness of exile, there are points of light. And as we get closer to the Messianic age, we're seeing more and more light, more and more miracles. and more positive things. But of course, we're spoiled, and we don't just want more, we want it all. And we're entitled to it after so many years of suffering and exile. The Parsha later on carries one of the most important sections, the one that deals the Shema, the second Parsha of the Shema. We know that we're supposed to recite the Shema every morning and every evening. The Shema consists of 3 paragraphs. And the first paragraph was mentioned last week. The second paragraph is at the end of this week's Parsha, in which God lays out what happens if we follow His commandments and what will happen if we don't follow His commandments. And there's several verses here that there's some interesting comments made by the Hasidic masters. For example, it says, "Va'avadatem mehera," you will perish quickly. That's a simple meaning, that God is threatening if we don't do what we have to do in the land will not be irrigated by the rains, and the earth will not produce, and you will be destroyed or perish quickly. The Baal Shem Tov once translated that you have to destroy the quickness. There's a tendency that we have that we want to do a mitzvah, we want to pray. We all have times when we're in a rush. Sometimes it's good to be in a rush to do a mitzvah, but it's not a good thing to rush doing the mitzvah. And the Baal Shem Tov says you have to get rid of the mehera, the quick attitude, that you have to do everything right away, quickly, without preparing for it, without getting into it in a real internalizing way. Chassidim put a lot of emphasis on preparations for a mitzvah, for prayer. There was once a chassid who came to another great chassid, Reb Hillel of Parich, and he said, before prayer, and every morning I study Chassidus, and I meditate on it and I reach a real high point, a spiritual high, and then I start praying, and I don't feel the high anymore. It all fizzles out. So Reb Hillel says to him, why does it disturb you that you pray before you pray? Because the preparation for prayer is also part of prayer. Preparation for a mitzvah is part of the mitzvah. And that's a very important teaching in the Hasidic community. That's why we're told that your sins don't start registering until the first day of the holiday of Sukkot. Yom Kippur, you get rid of all your sins. But what about the 4 days in between? So the Midrash says you're too busy doing mitzvahs. You don't have time. So one of the Hasidic masters says because those 4 days you're preparing for the holiday. And while you're engaged in preparation, you're in a spiritual state of mind, in a certain sense even higher than the mitzvah itself. Of course, if you prepare and you don't do the mitzvah voluntarily, then it's not considered preparation. Then there's at the end of the paragraph, it says, in order that your days shall be prolonged, and the days of your children, where? Upon the land that God has sworn to your forefathers to give them, like the days of the heavens over the earth. So the verse implies that where do you enjoy longevity? On the land. Which land? The land of Israel. So the Talmud tells a story that a certain Israeli rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan, who lived in Israel, and he was told that there were old people in Babylonia. You see, the Jewish community was then split into 2 major centers. Israel was one major center, but Babylonia was a second and even larger Jewish center of scholarship. And Rabbi Yochanan was the head of the academy, the leader of the Talmudic scholars in Israel. And some people came from Babylonia, and there were a lot of people traveling back and forth, and they said there were some old people living in Babylonia, and he was puzzled. He says, how could that be? It says in the Torah that your days will be lengthening on the land. That means in Israel you can enjoy long life, but how do you enjoy long life outside of Israel? So he was probing to find out what did they do that was different, that enabled them to enjoy the same blessing that you have in Israel. And they told him that they heard or they saw, that people would get up very early to go to the synagogue to pray, and they would stay very late in the synagogue to continue praying or learning Torah. Ah, he said, that's why they have long life. So the question is, what's the connection? If it just meant that they do good things, there are many good things they did. Why did he pick on getting up early and staying late? So there's an ingenious interpretation given by, I don't know the author of this book, Kehilas Yitzchak is the name of the book. It's quoted by another text. The Gemara talks about how you have to treat your laborers. You hire people to work, and the custom in that place is that people don't do overtime. They come 9, they work to 5. No one gets up early, no one stays late. Now you're giving them a raise. You're giving them more money than let's say it's $15 an hour, and you're giving them $20 an hour. And then you say, I expect you to come earlier. Instead of 9, come 7 and stay late. Instead of 5, stay till 8, or whatever the times are. And they say, well, why? I mean, we never did that. He said, but I gave you more money. They can't be forced to do overtime. They could say to him, yes, we understand you gave us a raise. We understand that there's a quid pro quo for it, but that means that you want us to do better work, better quality work. We'll try harder. We'll be more energetic. But that doesn't mean we have to get up early and stay late. So what do you see from this Talmud? That getting up early to do something or staying late to continue something is the same, is equal to doing a job much better. So that's why Rabbi Yochanan realized Israel, the quality of what people do in Israel is a higher quality. There's just that holy atmosphere, and there's just a higher quality to the mitzvahs they do and to the prayers that they say. So he didn't understand it. In Babylonia, there's a deficiency of that. How do they make up for it? They make up for it. They get up early and they stay late. Sometimes quantity can take the place of quality. Many people, of course, prefer quality, and a lot of people will desist from doing good things because I don't have the feeling for it. I don't have the enthusiasm. I'm not sincere enough. I don't really put my whole heart and soul in it. Well, one way of compensating for that is doing more. When you do more, God regards it as if you did it with a greater amount of sincerity and intensity and vigor. One final thought. At the end of the Parsha, God challenges us to go in His ways. So Rashi says, what does that mean, to go in His ways? What ways does God go in? He's merciful. You should be merciful. He bestows kindness. You should bestow kindness. So someone once asked, it says that God is also a God of vengeance, a God of zealousness. So why doesn't it say, just like God is zealous, so should we be zealous? So Rabbi Yitzchak of Volozhin, one of the great Lithuanian sages, who was not part of the Hasidic movement, but he was very close to the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe. Anyhow, he says there's a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud that describes God's zealousness and His vengeance. I, God says, I am in control of my vengeance. The vengeance is not in control of me. If you could emulate God in that regard, that you're in control of your own feelings of vengeance, of anger, and being indignant, and taking revenge, motivated solely by God's concern for God, a concern for righteousness, and you're in total control. You could control the exact amount of anger you need and not a bit more, the exact amount of discipline that you need and not a bit more. But be my guest, emulate God. But since most people can't do that, that's not the standard meaning of this. Don't go in God's ways by being vengeful. Don't say, well, God did this, punish these people, I'll start punishing people. You can't emulate that. But compassion, you could. Kindness, you could. Have a good night and a good Shabbos and a good week.